The Outer Worlds 2 has landed, a semi-open world RPG sequel to the 2019 original. Familiar UE5 tech takes the helm here, while signature Obsidian RPG systems and narrative drive the experience. But how does it run across all console systems, including PlayStation machines? Is this a satisfying role-playing adventure? The Outer Worlds 2 looks very appealing, but in some rather familiar ways. Expect to see all the hallmarks of Unreal Engine 5. The lumen lighting system drives the game's presentation, as shade pools and crevices and balanced light drives subtle illumination of adjacent surfaces. It has that classic UE5 look, exaggerated but visually exciting with a vibrant and dynamic appearance. On consoles, we're looking at softer lumen, it seems, which pushes the lighting in a bit of a punchy direction. Lumen also contributes specular reflections. For a sci-fi game, Outer Worlds doesn't have many surfaces that are glossy enough to receive lumen reflections, so environments end up looking very diffuse and rough. The game has a sort of retro-futuristic aesthetic that apes the material conventions of the early to mid-20th century, when smoother glasses and plastics weren't as common. That may prove helpful for performance as well. Nanite makes the world feel very stable with minimal pop-in. Occasionally you'll see some object or shadow snap into view in the distance, but Outer Worlds is a game that's typically free of any draw distance instability. Examined up close, key models typically sport generous polygonal detail, with finely curved pipes, rivets, and screws. Natural features like rock faces will typically be sculpted to a lower standard, and sometimes an especially flat building face will stand out. And don't expect any avatar-like density up close, but generally speaking the game is modeled to a high standard. Virtual shadow maps are also present, mixed with screen space shadows as needed to fill in small details. Outer Worlds features a dynamic time of day with a continuously changing sun position, which blends very nicely with VSM tech. There's little apparent shadow aliasing, even when shadows crawl across the environment in front of you. Like a lot of other UE5 games though, the Outer Worlds 2 is relatively static. Grenades make essentially zero impact upon the world, and bullet strikes typically leave just a small decal. The world is pretty but usually not that affected by player actions. In other RPGs perhaps that wouldn't be such a big issue, but Outer Worlds is built around action gameplay that often generates explosive moments. The Outer Worlds 2 does feature a pretty decent character creator. It's template-based, so your appearance is driven primarily by one of a couple dozen heads to pick from, but you can push around some Bethesda-style sliders to modify them to your tastes. This is bounded somewhat, so you can't create any truly hideous characters, but I think this system strikes a good balance between customizability and ease of use. Facial rendering in general is quite pleasing as well, with good-looking visages and dialogue scenes. The Outer Worlds 2 has two visual modes available at 60Hz output on Series X, a performance mode and a quality mode. Visual divergences here are relatively slim on a feature level, as they both feature the key UE5 tech, including lumen reflections, which are often cut in other games' performance modes. The biggest concession here probably comes down to foliage. Foliage coverage along with other bits of ground clutter is noticeably sparser in the performance mode. Foliage lighting can also differ somewhat, like with these grasses or with these red trees. Grass draw isn't a particular issue in performance mode, but grass past a few meters from the player is completely static. Approaching these bushes and grasses makes them suddenly pop into a new position as they animate, which is highly distracting. Quality mode has similar compromises, but the distance at which the underbrush flows in the wind is pushed out quite a bit. Expect to see some lighting differences as well. Flipping back and forth reveals noticeable lumen divergences, which are most notable in interior scenes. In this scene, for instance, more light appears to be blocked by the pipes and trolley in performance mode, while quality mode casts a more realistic scene. VSM resolution takes a hit in performance mode with obvious stair-stepping artifacts. Image quality takes a minor hit in performance mode as well. The quality mode appears very 4K-like, while the performance mode takes a minor hit in sharpness and stability. Internally, the performance mode seems to lie a bit north of 1080p typically, while the quality mode appears around 1440p or higher in the shots I tested, though it's very challenging to pixel count this mode. The Outer Worlds 2 looks surprisingly similar between its quality and performance modes on Series X. Usually we see a bit more divergence between modes in UE5 titles, but Outer Worlds 2 seems built for console 60 FPS play. The game's frame rates bear that out. In performance mode, you can expect a close to locked 60 FPS in most game content, including fiery fights and open world traversal. I did notice some minor exceptions in the second planet. I'm not sure what to expect in further areas, but from the first hours of play, I haven't seen anything that would cause a particular concern, especially if you're playing on a VRR set. Quality mode clocks in at a steady 30 FPS update, which is to be expected given the performance mode's solid 60 FPS clip. There's one final mode on Series X consoles, a 40 FPS balanced mode at 120Hz output. This seems to run with a 4K target as well. In comparisons though, visual settings seem more closely matched to the performance mode, while image quality seems more in line with quality mode, with a 4K-like output. I can't capture this mode at full resolution or get effective pixel counts though, owing to capture limitations. Performance is solid here, with a 40 FPS output across my gameplay. For a UE5 title, Outer Worlds 2 is an excellent performer, especially considering its large gameplay spaces and NPC-dense towns. The Outer Worlds 2 has some additional configuration options I wanted to touch on. The first is fairly straightforward, as there's an FOV slider that ranges from 50 degrees all the way to 121. I suspect the default 90 degrees will suit most players, but if you want a wider or more claustrophobic view, these options are available. The game had certain options available in the performance and quality modes that indicated that they would cap the output at 1080p in the patch available prior to launch. But these modes didn't seem to do anything, with very similar image quality between the option being toggled on and toggled off. These 1080p modes do not appear in the final game, and players will never see it in any circumstance, as Outer Worlds 2 seems to ship without most of the game data on disk, requiring an update to the latest version to play. The Outer Worlds 2 has an option to tweak its motion blur settings from 0% to 100%, with a default value of 20%. But in practice, this doesn't seem to do anything. Every time you adjust a setting, it returns to 20%, and the in-game results show zero variance in blur strength between the options. This makes the game especially challenging to pixel count, so I had to rely on shortcuts in dialogue sequences instead of using gameplay shots, which I would have normally preferred. In the pre-release period, the motion blur slider only appeared upon first boot. It didn't show up in the standard settings menu, and it also didn't affect the game. The game's current state is an improvement, but obviously these settings should adjust game behavior. Let's move on to other consoles, starting with Series S. At 60Hz output, we have only one mode option, a 30 FPS targeting quality mode. This mode seems to feature similar visual settings to the Series X performance mode, but with some differences in the foliage. Most obviously, the distance at which grass animates is pushed out further in this quality mode, which is a curious difference. Other settings seem reasonably close, with lumen reflections and similar VSM resolution. Image quality does take a hit here, with a softer resolve in the final image. I suspect Series S is being upsampled to a bit of a lower resolution here than Series X. Internally, pixel counts are a bit lower, with counts coming in around 1080p in the Series S quality mode. Expect a locked 30 FPS here, which matches performance in the Series X quality mode. At 120Hz output, a balanced mode joins the fray. Expect similar underlying visual settings with similar foliage and lighting, but the image is a touch softer and substantially noisier. Internally, shots that count at approximately 1080p in quality mode clock in at roughly 864p in balanced mode. 40 FPS is the target here, and 40 FPS is typically achieved. Expect a smooth update with no dips in typical gameplay. There's no performance mode on Series S, so this is the highest framerate option for gamers on Microsoft's junior console. PS5 and Series X look quite similar. The PS5 performance mode has a slightly softer output and a bit more image breakup, with an internal resolution that is a bit lower than Series X, at roughly 1080p in the shots I tested. Visual settings, though, seem similar between the two consoles. Performance in this mode is decent, but worse than Series X, with occasional framerate drops, which are accompanied by screen tearing. I only had time to scour the first planet on PlayStation consoles, but in these performance hotspots, you can see dips. Quality mode is a bit more of a match between the two consoles, with a 4K-like resolve and similar internal resolutions on both machines. But frame rates in this mode on PS5 aren't as good as I'd like, as the 30 FPS update is dented by frame time dips with screen tearing in heavier areas. It's unusual for a 30 FPS console game to have substantial frame rate dips, so this is not great behavior. It's hard to compare balance mode and appropriate detail owing to capture limitations, but I did notice a bit of a lighting delta between the two in some shots, suggesting perhaps some small downgrades on PS5. Frame rates again are a little wobbly, with a shaky run of play in heavier areas. One upside on PS5 amidst the downgrades is that this visual bug, which presents as these brightly colored jagged outlines on grass and in some other scenes on Series X, were not present on PS5, but the motion blur bug does show up on PS5. PS5 Pro does something interesting, though it's not entirely welcome. I don't want to talk about visual settings or resolutions here, which seem close to Series X. Instead, the main differentiator on PS5 Pro is PSSR. Yes, Sony's proprietary upscaler appears to be in use on PS5 Pro consoles, judging from its characteristic noise, edge resolve, and pulsing patterns on foliage. The problem with PSSR in this game in particular is that it seems to interact very unfavorably with the game's lumen lighting. On other consoles, lumen is mostly free of distracting noise patterns, but PS5 Pro is remarkably unstable around typical lumen pain points and is less than ideal in general gameplay. PSSR often interacts unfavorably with RT lighting effects, which usually lean on upscalers to produce a visually acceptable result. I'd be curious to hear what other players think of the PSSR use in The Outer Worlds 2 once they get their hands on the finished game. This isn't the worst combination of UE5 and PSSR I've seen, as Silent Hill F proves more problematic. But I don't think that PSSR is the right upscaler for this title, at least in the implementation here. In performance terms, expect a turnout in these modes that's similar to PS5. Frame rate dips and more intense encounters are common, and the general run of play is noticeably worse than Series X. The Outer Worlds 2 is an excellent looking console game, and on Xbox, I think this is a very good technical experience. Expect solid performance on both Xbox Series machines, with satisfactory image quality and full-throated visual features on Series S. In Alex's testing, lower-end PC CPUs seem to struggle in denser areas, which just isn't the case on Xbox. But PS5 consoles are a little shakier. It's possible that the PS5 versions are coming in hot, which would make sense if they had to be brought up mid-development after a management decision. It's also possible that the Xbox Series versions are making significant use of hardware features that aren't present on PS5 consoles or are present integrated form. Whatever the case, PS5 and Pro underperform in The Outer Worlds 2 in unusual ways, compared to the typical run of play we've seen so far this generation. I'd caution Pro owners in particular, as I suspect many players will prefer the visuals on base PS5. Beyond the tech, I didn't love The Outer Worlds 2. Despite its RPG trappings, you spend a lot of time shooting, and I found the core gunplay unengaging. Enemies are often bullet sponges, health pack management is key, and ammo drops are often scarce, which tend to lean away from my own personal shooter preferences. The controls are a little laggy as well, which can be addressed in part by bumping sensitivity, but it never feels as snappy as it should. The RPG systems seem more interesting, though the plot and themes didn't connect with me. I expect if you enjoyed the original, you will find a lot to like here, but if you bounced off the first game like I did, I don't think this will prove appealing. I do think that The Outer Worlds 2 is a strong technical experience for RPG fans though, and it's fine enough across the consoles. But if you have a choice between console systems, I'd pick Series X. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.